50 years of failed climate predictions. Today we want to talk about something that's been cycling through headlines and dinner table debates for generations now. The endless drumbeat of warnings that carbon dioxide is basically poison gas, that we're all doomed in the next handful of years unless we overhaul everything about modern life. You know the script. Stop eating beef because of cow burps. Swap your straws for paper to save the turtles. Skip having kids because the planet can't handle more people. Ditch your car. Forget vacations. Chase net zero at all costs. It's been going on since the middle of the last century, and the deadlines keep slipping, but the urgency never does. We're going to unpack the long track record here, look at what actually happened versus what was promised, and why the whole narrative feels more like a rerun than fresh science. Stick around because this one cuts right to the heart of trust, fear, and what real progress looks like when people get to choose for themselves. Imagine for a second you're flipping through old news clips or scientific journals from decades ago. The experts are dead serious, eyes wide, telling anyone who will listen that time is almost up. Famine is coming by the mid-1970s. Civilization itself might collapse by the end of the century if we don't act. Whole oceans dead, cities underwater, mass extinctions kicking off any day now. Polar bears starving on melting ice, kids who will never see snow. It's dramatic, emotional stuff designed to grab your attention and make you feel like the only moral choice is to sacrifice convenience, freedom, and comfort right this second. And every time the clock runs out without the apocalypse showing up, the goalposts quietly slide forward another decade or two. That's the pattern we're talking about today, the one that's repeated so often it starts to feel like a script rather than evidence-based forecasting. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's walk through what was actually said, what the data shows now, and why the mismatch matters more than ever in a world that's also powering artificial intelligence at record levels while conflicts rage on. Let me remind you, if any part of this discussion resonates with you, perhaps a striking historical anecdote or an insightful revelation, please consider liking and sharing the episode and ensuring you're following or subscribing for future updates. Here's the part that hits hardest when you line it all up. The predictions have a perfect record of not happening. Back around the first big Earth Day push in the early 1970s, leading voices were forecasting dire famine sweeping the globe by 1975, water and food rationing in major economies by the late 70s and early 80s, and even the possibility of a new ice age locking things down by the turn of the millennium. One prominent biologist warned that hundreds of millions could die of starvation in the 1970s and 80s alone, with life expectancy dropping sharply and oceans turning lifeless. Another set of claims had everyone disappearing in a toxic blue haze by the late 80s. Fast forward a bit, and the same circles were promising irreversible tipping points by 2016, ice-free Arctic summers that never arrived on schedule, and nations vanishing under rising seas well before now. The 12 years left to act line got dusted off and reused so many times it started feeling like a marketing slogan rather than a deadline rooted in physics. None of the hard apocalyptic dates landed. Not the mass die-offs, not the runaway cooling then sudden heating that was supposed to swallow coastlines, not the total ecosystem collapse. Temperatures have warmed some, sure, but the Hollywood-level catastrophe never materialized. The planet didn't become uninhabitable. Crops didn't fail globally. People adapted, technology moved forward, and life kept going. That's not opinion. That's the observable record over more than half a century. And when you stack those expired forecasts against today's reality, it becomes impossible to ignore how much fear was sold on credit that never got paid back in results. What makes this even more striking is how the very thing they call toxic, extra carbon dioxide, has been quietly doing the opposite of what the panic merchants claimed. Satellite data going back decades shows huge stretches of the planet's vegetated land greening up significantly. We're talking a measurable increase in leaf area equivalent to adding twice the size of a major continent's worth of new greenery in some analyses. And the primary driver? That same carbon dioxide acting like fertilizer for plants. It boosts photosynthesis, helps crops grow faster and stronger, especially in drier regions, and turns out to have a mild cooling feedback too through better evapotranspiration. More CO2 in the air has literally made Earth lusher on a global scale. That's not spin, it's direct observation from space-based instruments tracking vegetation indices over 30+ years. Instead of a barren wasteland, we've got more plant life pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and feeding more animals and people. The logic here is straightforward. If the core claim was that this gas would choke the biosphere, but the biosphere responded by expanding, then maybe the framing of toxicity was always more emotional than empirical. It flips the emotional script from dread to wonder. Imagine telling someone in the 1970s that rising CO2 levels would help turn deserts a little greener and support bigger harvests. They might have called you crazy, yet here we are. Then there are the specific policy hysterias that got pushed hard as moral imperatives. Remember the campaign against beef because livestock methane was supposedly the climate killer? Turns out enteric emissions from cattle make up a fraction of total greenhouse gases globally, around the same ballpark as rice paddies or landfills when you run the full accounting. It's part of a short-cycle loop where grass grows, cows eat it, and the methane breaks down faster than long-lived CO2 from other sources. Yet the push was to eat the bugs instead, as if swapping one protein source for another was the only ethical path. Or the viral push to ban plastic straws after one heartbreaking video of a turtle with one in its nose. Straws are a tiny sliver of ocean plastic, Most comes from abandoned fishing gear and mismanaged waste far upstream. The emotional pull was real, but the scale never matched the outrage. Same with bottle caps or single-use plastics in general. The focus stayed laser-sharp on everyday consumer choices while bigger systemic realities got a pass. Polar bears became the poster child too. Iconic images of skinny bears on shrinking ice suggested imminent extinction. But the latest population surveys put the global number around 26,000, with many subpopulations stable or even doing better in areas where reduced multi-year ice actually improved hunting access. The rebound from mid-century lows, when overhunting was the bigger issue, happened alongside the warming, which undercuts the starvation narrative pretty cleanly. Now layer in the modern contradictions that make the whole narrative feel incoherent. Artificial intelligence is exploding in capability and adoption, which means data centers and training clusters are sucking down electricity at unprecedented rates. Projections show that sector's consumption could nearly double or more in the coming years, heading toward 1,000 terawatt-hours globally as servers optimized for AI workloads grow 30% annually. That's real, measurable demand happening right now, powering tools that are transforming medicine, logistics, and creativity. Yet the same voices demanding net zero by arbitrary deadlines rarely apply the same urgency to this surge. It's as if the rules bend when innovation and prosperity are on the line. And then there are the conflicts raging around the world. Military operations and the broader defense footprint generate emissions on a scale that dwarfs many targeted industries. Estimates put the global military sector at around 5.5% of all greenhouse gases if counted as one entity, making it larger than some entire continent's outputs. One ongoing war alone has already pumped out hundreds of millions of tons of CO2 equivalent from fires, fuel use, reconstruction, and displaced activity, comparable to a major economy's annual total. Habitat gets torn up, pollution spreads, and the environmental cost is immediate and massive. Yet those same conflicts rarely trigger the same calls for degrowth or lifestyle sacrifice that get aimed at families, farmers, and commuters. The selective outrage reveals more about control than consistency. The human and economic toll of all this fear-driven pressure is where the logic really stings. Billions in taxpayer funds funneled into mandates, subsidies, and symbolic gestures that delivered little measurable planetary benefit while crowding out genuine innovation. Socially, it fed into anxiety, lower birth rates, and a cultural shift that sometimes treated having children as environmentally selfish. People internalized the guilt, sterilized dreams of bigger families, or turned to processed alternatives pushed as planet-friendly without weighing the full trade-offs. That's not abstract. It's lived experience for a generation raised on doomsday deadlines that never arrived. The pattern recognition here is cold and clear. When every prediction fails, the rational response isn't to double down on the same fear with bigger regulations. It's to question the incentives behind the narrative. Why does the urgency always demand top-down sacrifice from regular people while exempting the high-energy sectors or geopolitical realities that actually move the needle? Reason says the models that missed so badly shouldn't dictate policy. Emotion says stop scaring kids into thinking the world ends in 12 years every 12 years. A few voices from the record drive this home better than any summary. One leading biologist in the late 60s and early 70s warned of mass starvation killing hundreds of millions by the 1980s, with the oceans as dead as a polluted lake and society rationing basics. Another prominent figure predicted the point of no return on warming by the mid-2010s, with flooded cities and vanished ice caps. Those quotes weren't fringe, they were mainstream, repeated in major outlets, and used to justify sweeping changes. Looking back, they stand as cautionary tales about how certainty in forecasting can blind us to human adaptability and technological surprise. The Earth didn't follow the script. Instead, it greened. Populations of iconic species held or grew. Energy demand shifted but didn't collapse civilization. The failed forecasts didn't just miss. They missed in ways that highlight the resilience of free people solving problems when left to their own ingenuity. So where does that leave us? Not with a call for new mandates or forced transitions, because those have a track record of waste and resentment without delivering the promised salvation. The only path that has ever scaled real environmental gains alongside prosperity is one where free markets let individuals and innovators choose what works. People deciding for themselves, without subsidies propping up one technology or regulations punishing another, whether to drive electric, hybrid, or efficient internal combustion, what diet fits their lives and local resources, or how many kids they want to raise. Unsubsidized, unmandated choices driven by price signals, competition, and genuine value. When energy gets abundant and cheap through whatever mix wins on merit, nuclear, advanced renewables, improved fossils, or breakthroughs we haven't imagined yet, emissions trends bend naturally without the guilt trip. History shows free people, chasing better lives, have cleaned rivers, cut real pollution, and expanded food production faster than any centralized plan. The alternative is the repeated cycle of fear that erodes trust and wastes resources. We've seen enough of that rerun. Time to let reality, not recycled panic, set the agenda. Keep questioning, keep thinking, stay free.